Are you having a faith crisis? Are you trying to reconcile your understanding of scientific findings with your knowledge of Genesis? Did all of these Grand Canyon rock layers form in the 1 year of Noah's flood? Are the days of creation actual 24-hour days? Where was the Garden of Eden located? Did Methuselah really live to 969? Was Noah's flood global or local? Is evolution a belief or a fact? Were Adam and Eve real people? A worldview approach to science and scripture podcast series by geologist-apologist Carol Hill will help you find the answers to these questions and more. Science versus religion. What if there was never a conflict? Find out why, from a worldview approach, there is no conflict.
The purpose of this podcast series is to present solid science to the church, not to destroy faith, but to reconcile science with faith as a way to truth. This is not a young earth podcast, but is based on the sciences of archaeology, anthropology, geology, and astronomy. This is a new weekly podcast series, a worldview approach to science and scripture. Podcast series starts on Sunday, September 1st, 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2 o'clock p.m. Central Mountain Time, and continues for 11 weeks total at the same time. Credits: narration by Daniel Hill. Royalty-free music composed by D. Brown and produced by 2U Films, Steve Pointer. Hello, everyone. Today we're on podcast number 5, and we're going to be talking about the numbers and chronologies of Genesis. So podcast 5 will be the numbers and chronologies of Genesis. Did Methuselah really live to be 969 years? And here's a picture, a stained glass window of Methuselah, who, according to Genesis 5:27, lived to be 969 years old. In this podcast, it is argued that the patriarchs' ages are numerological numbers, not numerical. Overview. In podcast number 3, we discussed the traditional position of the Christian church that creation took 6 literal days. In this podcast, we will discuss the traditional church view that the earth is only about 6,000 years old. How does biblical tradition come up with a 6,000-year age for the earth? It assumes a 6-day creation, and then it tallies up all of the patriarchal generations since Adam, and reigns of kings recorded in Genesis and the rest of the Bible to arrive at a figure of approximately 6,000 years. In this podcast, we will also expand our age of Earth discussion to see if the chronologies of Genesis can be reliably used to obtain Earth's age. Is our planet Earth really only 6,000 years old, as claimed by young Earth creationists on a so-called literal reading of Genesis? Or is it 4.56 billion years old, as claimed by old Earth creationists, based on the scientific evidence of both geology and astronomy? Let's have a little bit of history here. One of the first attempts to approximate the age of Earth and creation was that of the renowned Jewish scholar Jose ben Halfallah, who in the 2nd century AD calculated that Adam was created about 3760 BC, which date has become part of the Orthodox Jewish tradition and is the basis for the Jewish calendar. The most famous of these literal chronologies is Bishop Ussher's exact date that he calculated from Genesis in 1654 for the creation of the earth. Sunday, October 23rd, 4004 BC. This seems laughable to us today, but we should remember that this was all people knew at that time. The Bible and what they could observe. They knew no modern science, so their pre-scientific worldview should be expected. This is the whole point of a worldview approach. There is no modern science in the Bible, so it should not be forced upon an ancient text. And here's Bishop Ussher, Archbishop of Armagh, Ireland, and one of the most formidable biblical scholars of his time. The Mesopotamians' worldview of numbers. They had a sexagesimal numbering system. The mathematical text of the Sumerian and Babylonians who lived in southern Mesopotamia show that these people were using a sexagesimal, that's a base 60, not a base 10, numbering system, at least by Uruk time, about 2100 BC. Examples of this ancient system are still with us today in the form of the 360-degree circle and 60-minute hours and 60-second minutes. The Sumerian wrote their numbers in cuneiform, a series of wedged marks impressed on a clay tablets. This is one of those tablets, a Sumerian cuneiform clay tablet from Jemet Nasser, Iraq. The earliest writing denoted commodities, but it later evolved into a narrative form. Sacred symbolic numbers. The Mesopotamians incorporated two concepts of numbers into their worldview. Numbers could have real values, and numbers could be symbolic descriptions of the sacred. Real numerical numbers were used in accounting and commerce, but certain numbers, 60, 600, 3,600, were considered sacred and thus occupied a special place in their religious ideas. For example, Noah is said to have been 600 when the flood started. This was the sacred number because Noah was considered to be sacred. Numerological numbers were often exaggerated, but this was no problem because their worldview included a dual concept of numbers. Thus, the long ages of the patriarchs made sense to them, but not to us. For example, in the Sumerian king list, one king was said to have reigned for over 28,000 years, and we think that Methuselah was old. Symbolic numbers. The purpose of numbers in ancient religious texts could be numerological rather than numerical. Numerologically, a number's symbolic value was the basis and purpose for its use, not the secular value in a system of counting. And one of the religious commitments of scribes involved with numbers was to make certain that any numbering scheme used added up to the right number symbolically. This is distinctly different from a secular use of numbers in which the overriding concern is that the numbers add up to the correct total arithmetically. Another way of looking at it is that the sacred numbers used by the Mesopotamians had honorific value, which gave a type of religious dignity or respect to important persons or to a literary text. As numerical symmetry and harmony, as covered in podcast number 3, concerning the parallel arrangement of the 6 days of Genesis, there is a symmetry and regularity to the early chapters of Genesis that cannot be accidental. Rather, there seems to have been an intentional attempt to impart religious harmony and prosaic beauty to the text, corresponding with the style of literature at that time. For example, each genealogy presented in chapters 5 and 11 of Genesis includes 10 names. And to break a text into a 10-generational pattern was common for many Near East people groups at that time. In addition, each of these 10 generations ends with a father having 3 sons. For example, in Genesis 5:32, Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It thus appears that the symmetry of Genesis, including its numbers, was purposely made by the authors, scribes, mathematicians who wrote, copied, and worked on the original text. And they did this because, in their worldview, it was important to create harmony in their literary writings, or to quote the Hebrew scholar Cassuto, this numerical symmetry is, as it were, the golden thread that binds together all parts of the section of Genesis and serves as convincing proof of its unity. This is the chart of the long ages of the patriarchs. Note the most important thing about this is the patriarchs Adam to Abraham are divided into 2 sets of 10. This was common way that the people of the Near East divided up. You have 10, so it's partially the decimal system. Note how many 60s are in this table. It's practically all 60s. That's because that was the sacred number, sexagesimal number for the early Mesopotamians. Note how many 60s there are in this table from Adam to Noah. All ages, 30 in all, are some combination of 60 or months and 7, both sacred numbers. In this section here, the upper section, knows some numbers end in 1, 3, 4, 6, or 8. And 8 numbers end in 5. That's because 5 years equals 60 months. So they've converted everything to 60. A chance probability of about 1 in 90 million. Note from Shem down to Abraham that the numbers start with 60s and start including the number 40. All of this cannot be coincidental. The Mesopotamians were using numerological numbers for the patriarchal ages. Therefore, these numbers should not be interpreted as real numbers. They had a sacred purpose to the Mesopotamians. Preferred or figurative numbers. Besides the perfect, sacred, exaggerated sexagesimal base 60 numbers used in the early chapters of Genesis, the rest of the Bible often uses preferred numbers. Preferred because they had spiritual, figurative meaning rather than a strict numerical meaning. Even a cursory reading of the Bible will reveal that certain numbers are used over and over and over again. These are 3, 7, 12, and 40. 3 was the number of emphasis in the Bible, e.g., for example, holy, holy, holy. 7, sacred number to the Jews because of the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week. 12, extended from the Old Testament to Christ. For example, 12 tribes, 12 apostles, etc. 40 applies to events. 40 days for Noah's flood, Jesus fasted 40 days, 40 nights, etc. How the concept of numbers has changed over time from Genesis to the present. Before 2000 BC in Mesopotamia, you had sexagesimal, exaggerated sacred numbers, 60 and 7, used in Genesis up to Abraham of the number 40. Around 1500 BC, Egypt, this is where the Israelites were now, in Egypt. So Egypt is using decimal numbers. So Joseph, Joshua, and Moses were using the preferred and figurative use of numbers 40, 12, and 3. Then at around 1000 BC in Palestine, they were using decimal numbers now, and no longer were they using sexagesimal or exaggerated number. And this was the time of Solomon and David. Real numbers were used, but they still had some religious use of preferred numbers. Now we come to the 1st century AD, the time of Christ. They were using mostly real numbers, but preferred numbers 3, 7, 12, 40, still used but were waning. Then by the time of the Middle Ages, during the church, when the church was started, they used real numbers only. Concept of sacred preferred numbers was lost. They are interpreted as literal numbers, which is still what many people do today in the church, is take all the ages of the patriarchs and assume they are literal, not realizing that way back when Genesis was used, they were sexagesimal, exaggerated, sacred numbers. In the 1800s to the present in the Western world here, cuneiform tablets were found, and the concept of sacred numbers was rediscovered by archaeologists. Well, now we're going to scriptural problems with biblical genealogies and chronologies. The matter of obtaining a creation date based on a literal addition of the patriarchal ages is not that plausible. If the whole genealogical record of the Bible is examined, we will discuss 3 major problems. Condensed genealogies. Genealogies in the Bible are frequently abbreviated by the omission of unimportant names. In fact, abridgment was the general rule, such as in Matthew 1:8, where Uzziah was not the son, but the great-great-grandson of Joram. Even when each member of a descendant series is said to beget the next, it is not necessarily evidence that some generations have not been omitted. 2. Overlap of patriarchal lifespans. If the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11 are both literal and complete, then from these numbers the death of Adam has to be dated to the generation of Noah's father, Lamech, and Methuselah would have died in the year of the flood. That is, if in that table that we showed you earlier, if you actually add all the dates up, Noah would have been a contemporary of Abraham for 58 years, and Shem, Noah's son, would have survived Abraham by 35 years. But where does Genesis indicate that any of these men were coeval? It doesn't make sense. In addition, there are 3 different numbering systems from Adam to the years of the flood: Masoretic, the Septuagint, and Sumerian. There is perhaps a more serious problem with assuming absolute literal ages for the Genesis chronologies. These ages differ significantly between the 3 versions of the Old Testament: the Masoretic, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan. So which one is correct? Most Jewish and Christian scholars have favored the Masoretic. However, the version used in Jesus' time was the Septuagint, and the discrepancies between the 3 accounts logically entail that they cannot all be true, and thus cannot be considered inviolate from the absolute literal point of view. You see here the Masoretic, all the ages of the patriarchs come to 1,656 years. In the Septuagint, they come to 2,262 years, and the Samaritan, they come to 1,307 years. A worldview approach to biblical chronologies and the age of planet Earth. We are back to the original topic of this podcast, number 5. What then is to be made of the Genesis chronology as they apply to the age of the earth? It seems from the evidence that biblical chronologies were intended by the biblical authors to confirm a specific line of Adam descent for the Jews in the Old Testament and for Jesus in the New Testament. They were not meant to set an absolute date for the creation of the earth. The most important conclusion of this chapter is that the patriarchal ages do not represent real numbers. They represent numerological numbers. Therefore, the genealogies of Genesis cannot be used for the construction of a chronology on an absolute time scale. It is forcing a purpose for the biblical chronologies that was never intended. A worldview approach to the numbers and chronologies of Genesis is important because it proposes that since the biblical authors held a pre-scientific worldview of numbers, the Genesis Genesis chronology cannot apply a 6,000-year-old age for planet Earth, and therefore the scientific evidence for a 4.5 billion year old Earth is not contrary to the Bible. This is our last podcast before we start on the subject of Noah. And in Noah, we're going to have 3 podcasts on Noah. We're going to have the first podcast is Noah's flood. Was Noah's flood historical flood or mythological? The next one on Noah, podcast on Noah, is going to be, was Noah's flood global or local? And then the third podcast is going to be on flood geology. Flood geology is the theory of young earth creationists that all the rock on a sedimentary rock on planet Earth was created in Noah's flood. So we'll see you next week when we start on Noah and the flood.